All right, colleagues, thank you very much for being here. My name is Juan Sanchez. I'm going to be the host today. Maybe just very quickly about me. I work with the International Water Management Institute, IWMI for short, part of the CGIR family of those research centers, but it's the only one focused on water resources. Yeah, so really welcome to this session on anticipating complex crises at the intersection of climate and conflict. And as you might have expected, today we're going to dive into a context of anticipatory action, early warning systems, and we're going to be dealing with the issues of climate, fragility, conflict, and migration. I just wanted to put this slide on because part of the work that we do specifically from IWMI is supported under one of the CGIR's initiatives on fragility, conflict, and migration. So that's the context under which much of the research that we will be presenting today is actually taking place. So the objectives of the day, I think what we wanted to do, also following the words on the plenary, right? They said that there's no fathers here, right? And the objective of this session is actually to share. So for us, I think it's important that that you raise your hands. Please be very open if you want to make a point. The objective of the session is to make it as participatory as possible. So if you want to come in, just please come in. I think all comments are obviously welcome, and we want to have also, as we move on the second part of the session, some brainstorming on what would be new ways or new geographies, new alternatives to continue doing and strengthening anticipatory action and community resilience. So our speakers, they're a little bit delayed, but I wanted just to have maybe a raise of hands, like from a 1 to 5. Like I thought that we were gonna be able to move around in the room, but it's a little bit packed. So who would say that has lot of like a very good understanding of anticipatory action? Who is an expert like Dr. Julian? Who can say, yeah, I am an expert, I have a PhD, or I've been working 20 years on anticipatory action? Okay, we have 1 and a half, yes? Right. And then who's completely new to the topic? Also for our colleagues online to also calibrate a little bit, new to the topic. Okay, also some experience on disaster risk management? Yes, okay, we have some experience on disaster risk management. Climate change? Yes, everyone. We experience it every single day. Okay, that's good to know. Yeah, and I also wanted to open the floor, maybe 1 or 2 things that you would like to take from today's session. Yes?
Just I would like to be enlightened somehow and just learn about things that I don't usually focus on.
Cool. Yeah, that's very good. Anybody else wants to share some of your expectations of today's session?
I work with a lot of civil society organizations in the Asia Pacific, and I'm interested to hear what types of things they could be watching for to anticipate where conflicts might be brewing.
Okay. I think one of the questions that I wanted to have in the round of introductions was from which sector we actually come from, right? Whether we were practitioners, researchers, government, NGOs, because that also tells us a little bit from which angle can we tackle the problems. I think that question was already answered in the plenary. That's why I changed it. But from today's program, apart from myself, that I come from the research sector, we are very, I would say, please come in, most welcome. We are very what is the word? We're very happy. We're very lucky to have Dr. Gabriel Pollen, because we have someone that is actually doing a anticipatory action and is doing disaster risk management on the ground, right? So we have a presentation today from Dr. Gabriel that is going to give us a little bit of a specific context of realities of droughts in Zambia. And I think that's going to be quite enlightening, because it's also going to set up the scene for real measures and real solutions and real challenges that we face, not only from the research side, but actually from the implementation side. So I think that's going to be quite interesting. Then we will hear from our colleague Tess de Boer from the Climate Center. She's going to give us a bit of a perspective of what do we mean by this forensic disaster analysis. It's a very interesting methodology. We hope that you enjoy the way that this specific research has been taken on. Then we will hear from our colleague Sinéad from Adelphi. She's also going to tell us about her research in Yemen. And then we hope that we can come together into a full discussion. But the rules are very clear. Come in whenever you want. I think this is a sharing space, so please let's be open. And if you have any questions, any issues, you're most welcome to come in at any point. So I think that without further ado, let us turn it over to Dr. Pollen. Can you hear us, Gabriel?
Yes, I can. I hope
Okay,
you can.
put your presentation here so that the colleagues can see what you wanted to share with us today. Now it's working. Okay, just as a brief introduction to Dr. Pollen. Dr. Pollen, as you can see from the screen, he's the national coordinator of the Disaster Management and Mitigation Unit of the government of Zambia. He also holds a PhD from SOAS University. So we hope that really this presentation can actually set the scene and put us in the context of real challenges, but real solutions in a country where we're facing some challenges, as you will hear from Dr. Pollen. Gabriel, please, the floor is yours.
No, thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation, and thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I think it's very, very clear that I work in the office of the Vice President, and I'm in charge of the Disaster Management Mitigation Unit. So just some kind of context, I think, before we delve into the topic of discussion today, which is really about the joint report that was produced back in 2020. Currently, Zambia is facing the worst drought in over 40 years, with 6.6 million people requiring food assistance, and there's substantial water stress across the country. And right now, for example, through the Ministry of Water Development and Sanitation, we are putting in place interventions to support resilience building. And part of it is immediate provision of water in water stress areas. Places that typically would have water this time around don't have any water. So we're rehabilitating boreholes that have run dry, going slightly deeper, more than 120 meters, just to try and access the water. And over 2,000 boreholes are earmarked for installation during this drought period, and 6.6 million people will be given food relief assistance over this time period. And because Zambia has not obviously received adequate rainfall, we are also on the process of importing some grain from within the region in order to supplement the stock that we've received. Over 1 million hectares of crop has been adversely affected. Wildlife is also badly affected, impacting adversely on the tourism sector, but also bringing about human-animal conflict, because now humans are competing with wildlife for water sources, especially in far-flung areas in the outskirts. I thought I should bring that context before I start talking about this, and then end with that context to sort of appreciate that this is an ongoing challenge within the context of Zambia. So in terms of my presentation today, the focus essentially is looking at the evolution of anticipatory action in Zambia, and then we'll look at the project that was implemented around following the 2018-2019 drought or dry spell, if you like. So we look at the Food and Water Security Project, delve into what the findings were and what lessons were learned around that time, and potentially some that could have been implemented in anticipation of the current drought that Zambia is facing. By way of background, just to appreciate that we do prepare national contingency plan every year based on the information that we receive from the Meteorological Department. In terms of rainfall season for Zambia, typically it would set out around mid to end of November, and it would last all the way to mid to end of March. So that would be a healthy rainy season, receiving substantial rainfall season. And if the distribution is proper, would expect that the water that would hit the ground would support and nurture plant growth. But what we've observed over the past 5-10 years really is the increased intensity and frequency of dry spells. We have late onset of rainfall. Rainfall would be coming in at the end of December, and it won't last as long as an expected period, which is essentially around end of March. So the national contingency plans would help us to focus what the rainfall season is going to look like. And then this forms the basis upon which we can draw some anticipatory interventions or actions that will be required in order to mitigate the impact of dry spell. So the national contingency plan, sorry, just the previous slide, I'm not yet done that. So the national contingency plans essentially will be a framework for the anticipatory action, because would have identified the risks that would characterize the rainfall season. 2018-2019 has indicated Zambia experienced a prolonged dry spell in Western Province and Southern Province as well, and this triggered a food and water crisis. You'd appreciate then that about 2.3 million Zambians were adversely affected around that period of time, substantial water stress and food insecurity. And we saw in that period of time an increase in cases of malnutrition, as well as deficits in food in areas where they'll typically have 3 meals. Some would reduce it to about 1 meal a day. Between 2018 and 2020, also, we had some compounding effects from COVID-19, I think, about 2020. And also in certain areas, we're experiencing droughts. We have places that had floods. So what the Disaster Management Mitigation Unit at the time was doing was really to deal with multi-hazards at the same time. And that was within the context of, resource scarcity, because substantial resources had to be channeled towards fighting COVID-19 whilst we're grappling with the effects of the dry spells and the floods around that period of time. So we will look at the findings of the Food and Water Security Project and some lessons learned from the anticipatory action recommendations that were made based on the project itself that focused on Western Province in Zambia. Next slide, please. So in terms of anticipatory action in Zambia, I think this is sort of a concept that is evolving as the paradigm around disaster risk reduction is also evolving. And we see that there is emphasis that's being placed upon risk reduction, and risk reduction is also drawing anticipatory action to the fore, to prominence. And this is a conversation that we're beginning to have even at the level of resource deployment, where we are speaking to Treasury, for example, to finance activities that typically they wouldn't. And the argument there is it's cheaper to work towards deploying resources on anticipatory action as opposed to after the fact when things would have happened, because then that tends to be quite expensive. So, trying to influence a paradigm shift from the perspective of Treasury and within a developing country context can also be quite daunting, because you have immediate competing needs, and anticipatory action sometimes may not be very attractive from the perspective of political expediency. So using the sowing window in the 2018-2019 period, we saw that 74 districts in 2 ecological zones were adversely affected, and DMMU piloted an anticipatory action project. First, there was a response towards floods. So we had a flood response protocol that was developed to inform early action. Currently, a drought protocol has been developed as well, and this is also helping to anticipate, to undertake anticipatory action initiatives and interventions in a much more robust, coordinated, and comprehensive manner. We know that CGR has assisted Zambia to develop the drought management system for drought risk mitigation, but there are some gaps there because this system is sitting at the Ministry of Agriculture, while the disaster risk reduction component is being coordinated in the Office of the Vice President and the office I chair. But we have a framework to ensure that there's substantial coordination there, and we have a structure known as the National Disaster Management Technical Committee, where the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Agriculture would sit, and we expect that they'll be providing information based on what they would extract from the drought management information system. Next slide, please. So in terms of Western Province, you see from the map of Zambia that it's on the western side, bordering Namibia, bordering Angola, a little bit of, but mostly it would be Angola. I think we share the largest border on that side. So the International Water Management Institute spearheaded in collaboration with the government of Zambia retrospective analysis for Western Province in order to understand the humanitarian food and water crisis situation. Now, what we did find was that in terms of the comprehensive disaster risk management framework for Zambia, there were some challenges that continued to persist, and some of them reflect really the bureaucratic deficiencies because of the processes that were required for budget approval, as well as coordination in order to have a much more effective response mechanism. So you find that the timeline between realignment of financial resources and their actual deployment to areas that would require them, takes quite a bit of time. And these disasters really require that resources be deployed as quickly as possible in order to mitigate any potential adverse effects. What we did observe also from the findings was that there was some limited community capacity to access, disseminate, and act on the early warning information. So the information was available based on the National Contingency Plan, which was then disseminated and approved by Cabinet. Now, at that level, you find that by the time it's coming to the community level, there are some places that require that NCP to be translated and then shared in local radio stations, for example, for communities to be able to act on that information in a timely manner. But we did observe some kind of lag from the time that information has been approved at the level of Cabinet to the time that information actually sifts down to the community levels. We do also acknowledge that there are some initiatives within the government from that period of time, which we've been trying to strengthen since then. It's been about 3-4 years now, where we have a multi-hazard contingency plan, not necessarily focused on drought or floods, but also other hazards that might that might threaten the developmental trajectory of the country. There are some technical working groups that have focused-based financing that are supposed to target early warning and early action strategies for drought. But what we do observe is that because of a lack of seamless coordination between the Ministry of Agriculture and ourselves at the disaster management, there seems to be insufficient flow of information to help build early action protocols that can then be supported by a budget from Treasury in a timely manner. So in addition to to fighting the drought. I mean, earlier this year, Zambia also experienced one of the worst cholera epidemics the country has experienced in the recent past, where over 700 people died from the cholera, and over 23,000 cases of cholera were recorded. But I think it's within the context of the multi-hazard contingency plan that we look at risks that are associated with nature, as well as those that are associated with the structure underpinnings of a particular locality, which then will determine the risk profile in terms of the disease epidemic outbreaks for the country. Next slide, please. So what we do see is that there are some drivers of water and food insecurity in Western Province. Some of them have touched upon them. The late onset of rainfall, the prolonged dry spells, therefore, for the 2019-2020 period, especially around 2020, we had the COVID-19 pandemic and the corresponding economic shocks, not just at the domestic level, but from the regional and global perspective, which disrupted supply chains of major commodities, leading to a weakening of the domestic economy. We do know, for example, around 2020, that Zambia's economy contracted quite substantially and experienced negative growth. But at the same time, what these dry spells do is that they create conducive conditions for the crop pests and disease infestations, as well as human diseases around that time. But one of the structural stylized facts, obviously, of Zambia are the levels of poverty as a developing country, which underpin the complex interaction of the multi-hazards that I've earlier referenced to. And within the context of the developing country perspective, we also have another stylized fact, which has to do with the poor access to markets in general, where communities have to travel long distances. For example, right now, the Food Reserve Agency has opened up community sales for the grain for communities that have the capacity to access the grain, but suffered from the droughts. So we see that the government, through the Food Reserve Agency, is moving the grain closer to these communities in order to encourage access to markets. But because of the dependence upon agricultural activities, mostly as the reflection of the structural character of Zambia's economy, we see that there's limited livelihood diversification in that context. So where communities would typically depend on agriculture because that's their main economic activity, and the lack of presence of industrial capability there, you find that once the crops have been badly affected by poor weather conditions, people have nothing else to do. And that's why, for example, now we're targeting 6.6 million in terms of offering food assistance. Next slide, please. So arising from the context that Western Province presents, in no way should be generalized, but does indeed indicate some of the problems that we have for Zambia, especially in the far-flung areas. We do recommend that there's needs to improve national level analysis of food insecurity and water access. And I think this has happened since the report was done. And that's why, for example, Zambia right now is moving toward resilience building. We also recommend proactive measures for future events. And we see some of those things coming to the fore for this particular one, to expand communication channels for early warning, basically trying to make use of traditional channels of communication for communities that typically would not receive this information, and as well as strengthening mechanisms for pre-funding access. And I think number 6 is quite big on the agenda. And we see, for example, right now, resources being channeled towards a public works program, which will help to build resilience for the communities in those areas. I think this is it. Thank you very much. Sorry, I had to kind of rush through that and connect it to what Zambia is going through right now. But thank you so much for kind attention and for the opportunity to present.
Thank you, Gabriel. Really, we would obviously would have enjoyed it much more if you would be here. But really, thank you for making space in your agenda. We know that you have other pressing issues to attend, but let me open the floor very quickly to see if there's any questions from what you have presented to us from the floor. The colleagues want to address. Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Sylvia Brown from Oxfam. I'm interested in what you said about how 74 districts were insured by OCHA. How does the insurance work? Does the money go straight to households or does it go to the government? Can you explain a bit more about that?
Can we take maybe 2 more questions and then we go back, Gabriel, back to you. Anybody else wants to come in? Madam?
I'd be interested to hear if there's any gender elements to some of the impacts and the consultations that they're doing.
Gabriel, did you get that one on gender? One more? Okay, let's take those 2 questions, please. Gabriel.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so and it's important also that you raise that question because one of the things that was recommended based on the 2018-2019 report was that, you know, anticipatory action would also include things such as insurance, and that what that would do is that it would make resources available at the time when they're needed most. So in 2022, Zambia received a payout from the African Risk Capacity of $5.3 million, and the way in which this payout was implemented was that we made use of the Ministry of Community Development and Social Services architecture to support households that were most vulnerable. So this was emergency cash payments to households that were considered to have been made vulnerable by the event of the drought. And just recently, we've received a payout of $9.9 million, and the WFP also on replica received about $3.3 million, giving us a total of around $13.3 million. And this money will support an expanded emergency cash transfer program. So that's how we intend to implement. So this would be money that would go to households that typically have been adversely affected. And in terms of a gender element to this, we do collect disaggregated data, and you will see that you would appreciate if you looked at that we have involved the gender department at Cabinet Office to help with ensuring that those considered most vulnerable, especially within the context of the gender differentials, are properly considered and supported. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any last questions before we let Gabriel go? Yes, madam, please.
I don't know where to talk exactly, but I'll talk at the screen. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I was wondering, you mentioned a little bit about the need to localize the anticipatory action plans at the local level. And I was wondering if you could at all expand on how the mechanisms by which this data is localized and directly meets the needs of people in localities specifically.
Gabriel, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So I'll respond to that. So I mean, we really have to unpack first what we mean by anticipatory action. Anticipatory action obviously is not a homogeneous instrument, so to say. It's basically based on what type of risks a particular community will face. So once you've understood what that risk is, we make use of traditional structures to spread information. In addition to what would be traditional media, like social media, for example, but there's some areas that won't have access to social media or television. So there, in those areas, we have, like, for example, if you understand our disaster management structures, at the national level, we have the National Disaster Management Technical Committee. Below it, we have the Provincial Disaster Management Technical Committees. And then at the district level, we have the District Disaster Management Technical Committees. And then below that, at the community level, we have what we call the Satellite Disaster Management Committees, which are constituted of members of the community, including traditional leaders, as well as community representatives. So it's at those regularized meetings, for example, that we would share experiences and information that would then profit an anticipatory action type of intervention at the local level.
Okay. We can discuss more. I think one of the interesting elements that we are also working with the Zambian government is to understand the economical impact of the savings through anticipatory action at the local level. So there are means and ways by which obviously we need to make it more effective working with communities, but also the issue of how to speak to power and how to ensure that policymakers are also on board with these issues of anticipatory action is very important. Yes, I think that just one last point that I wanted to make on the context of Zambia's presentation is that we have seen that we're talking and we've heard a lot in plenary about peace and conflict. There's so many different degrees in between, right? So the case that we're presenting here is a case maybe fragile, vulnerable, but not necessarily a conflict setting, right? So it's one of those elements that we need to consider, the spectrum of peace and conflict, where do actually fit on that scale, yeah? So with that, Gabriel, I think I thank you so much. I know you have a lot of things to attend, but we hope to see you in Ottawa in 2026 in the next conference. Thank you so much, yeah?
Thank you so much for the opportunity and have a good one, everyone. Thank you.
Okay, colleagues, now moving to the next, can you help me with the other presentation? So now let us move to the next presentation. How are you with the energies? Do you want to stand up and stretch a little bit? Or we're still okay? Yeah? Okay, good. Because I know that it's getting a little bit warm and active. But if you need to stretch, it's also part of the rules of the house. You can do it, no problem. Let me introduce Tess de Boer. Tess de Boer is a technical advisor at the Red Cross, Red Crescent Climate Center. She is also my partner in crime. So all the work that we present here is, or that we're going to present, some of the work that we're presenting here is done under a partnership agreement between IWMI and the Climate Center. So yeah, Tess is the focal point from the Climate Center angle, and she's really an expert. She has been working many years now on issues of anticipatory action. Actually, I asked her, don't think that I'm doing my WhatsApp messages while I'm on the back. I actually wanted her to give us just a specific input on what anticipatory action is, right? Like we have said it so many times, I don't know, in 30 minutes. So I wanted her to make a pause and just give us a standard baseline definition so that we know, all of us, that we're talking about the same thing. Yeah, so I think without further ado, Tess, let me give you the floor. No, sorry, one more thing. Also, she's fantastic because she's actually right now in Japan in another conference, and she was so kind to raise the hand and say, yeah, I want to actually go ahead and make the presentation. So thank you so much, Tess. Over to you.
Yeah, hi everyone. I sadly cannot see you, but I did hear Laura already in the background in the audience. So really great to be joining you here at NPAX, and I'm really sad I can't be there in person. My colleague Julianne is there, so she can also share more if you're interested. What I'll do today is do a very quick overview of anticipatory action exactly. I think Dr. Pollen already really highlighted all the key elements of it, but I'll just give a quick snapshot. And then I'll present a bit about these, I'll zoom out from this analysis that Dr. Pollen presented from Zambia, which was one of the versions of a forensic risk analysis to inform anticipatory humanitarian action, and share a little bit from what we also did in Honduras and some other contexts as well, and what we might be looking at going forward. And I think that's also something I really want to connect with all of you on in the Q&A after. I'm actually joining you from Understanding Risk at the moment. So this is a big topic that's being discussed in lots of fora right now. But there they've already wrapped up the conference and the party is happening at the moment. So I hope the background noise isn't too bad. So quick overview, anticipatory action, exactly as Dr. Pollen said, it means different things to different people. I come at it from a humanitarian perspective. I work within the Red Cross movement, of course. And we work a lot within the Anticipation Hub, which is a sort of knowledge sharing group that brings together a lot of different organizations that look into anticipatory action in different forms. Anticipatory action can be implemented also by different actors, right? So we have, it ranges from early warning, early action at the community or household level, into the humanitarian sector, but also, as Dr. Pollen also mentioned, there's also a lot of different approaches that governments are now taking as well, to implement some of this. And anticipatory action is often used synonymously with early warning, early action, forecast-based action, forecast-based financing. So you might have heard some of those terms in the past already. And what anticipatory action does is it kind of sits in between that spectrum of, it's part of the disaster risk management cycle, and it sits between the longer term disaster risk reduction, response and recovery, which means that it kind of sits in that window where we know an extreme event is going to happen. And we might know that quite long in advance. We might know it with a very short lead time, as we say. And what we want to do is in that window between having that warning and actually the impact of the event, to take early actions. And those early actions can have lots of different forms and can take a lot of different shapes. It can be risk communication, warning communication, but it can also really be actions that aim to reduce the impact of the event. So in the case of floods, that might be evacuation or putting up sandbags or whatever. In the case of a drought, that might have different types of forms, right? That could more be livelihood support, water infrastructure support. And another key component of anticipatory action is often pre-agreed, or at least sort of the opportunity to leverage finance before a crisis happens. So the idea is there that you have some form of an approach that enables you to trigger finance in advance. So we don't have to sit around and wait for disaster to happen before we actually get access to financial resources, but we can do something in advance. This is a bit more clear for shorter onset, like rapid onset hazards like floods. For a drought, like we were looking at in the case of Zambia, or dry spells actually, it's a longer process. So there we get into a space where there's a little bit more of a gray area between what is actually official response and what is anticipatory action there as well. So just to also highlight that. And we do anticipatory action for different types of hazards. It started off with more hydrometeorological hazards like floods, droughts, heat waves. But increasingly, it's also now applied to non-hydrometeorological hazards, such as the humanitarian impacts of conflicts, which could be displacement or disruption of essential services. And also things like, population movements that aren't related to conflicts, epidemics, locusts, etc. So they are natural hazards as well, but they're maybe not the classical things that we started off with. So I hope that gives a little bit of an overview, a sort of quick snapshot of the different types of anticipatory action. What I'll be speaking about is an approach that we've been using now more and more, that we're within the sector, is as a tool to really have a really in-depth understanding of the root causes of risk, of the different drivers of risk and impacts that complement our understanding of specific hazards. So it's trying to take a more multi-risk approach, understanding different drivers that result in impacts on communities, and what kind of forecasts and other information sources we could leverage to actually take action in advance and more effectively as well. So this is actually an example from the research in Zambia that connects to what Dr. Pollen was just mentioning. So we typically have windows of opportunity for anticipatory action, and that can go all the way from addressing the root causes of vulnerability to early action to minimize impacts, and then to the response to different impacts. And these are some of the examples of potential early actions that you can actually take, and the sources of information, forecasting information, are listed at the top of this image. So that can go from more longer term forecasts, such as seasonal outlooks based on, for example, El Nino, to more shorter term forecasting sources. And a very important source of information for this is also traditional knowledge systems, indigenous knowledge, and observational data, of course, as well, and expert information from a country. So this is not just like the quantitative data, but also very much what you get from communities. Now actually going into this, and I think what is very relevant, I think also for the NPAX conference, and I think a lot of you in the room will have a very practical experience with this as well, is what we're looking at is the interplay between natural hazards and influenced by climate change with fragility, elements of fragility, conflict, violence, which are often mediated through environmental factors, social factors, and economic factors. So I sit in the team in the Climate Center that really looks at conflict dynamics and how they interact with climate change and current climate risks as well. So more like current disaster risks. Oh, this is going very fast through the slides all of a sudden. I'm sorry. So the idea here is that we want to do these types of root cause analysis or sort of forensic disaster analysis to actually learn something from what happened in the past. We have all this experience from different events and different extreme events in the past, and it's often not really used in the next event. We really often see that we just keep doing the same things, and we actually lock in a lot of vulnerability into our response system in that way. So this cartoon kind of summarizes why it's really, really important to look back and learn together in a collective effort to then be able to inform our approaches going forward. And I think in the case of Zambia, the current drought is a very intense event that is happening and is affecting a lot of people at the moment. Learning from the 2018 to 2020 crisis is a very effective way to then also evaluate with partners, what can we do now? How can we actually just tweak the response here and there in a way that we can learn from the past as well. So this is actually from the Zambia report, but it outlines the methodology that we've been using in different studies. So how this actually started, and maybe I'll just go back for a second, is we started with, we learned from the forensic disaster framework, disaster analysis framework, which I'll be able to reference, like share a reference with you all as well. So what they really do is try to really dig very deep into the root causes of unsafe conditions. So who was in harm's way, and also understand what were the vulnerability dynamics that actually made people more prone to being affected. And we combine this with our experience within the Climate Center and with other partners in designing and implementing anticipatory action systems very specifically. So really looking at like forecasting quality, implementation, what kind of early actions are effective, etc. As well as a broader perspective on disaster risk reduction and what kind of interventions could we be exploring as well. So this is a summary of that methodology at the moment. So we try and combine the sort of multi-risk, multi-hazard perspective in event timelines. So we try and identify what were the relevant events before the big crisis event that we're looking at that already contributed to increased exposure or vulnerability of particular populations. We try to understand, of course, the impact of the event first. Then we actually look at like which drivers contributed to the impacts. We then also try and reconstruct what happened in terms of crisis response, who responded when and how did different drivers interact with the different impacts, because typically they come in, they don't all sort of align very nicely one-to-one. It's actually quite a messy web of interactions. And we try to visualize that through the sort of cognitive mapping, causal diagrams, causal loops. It's kind of the same word for systems mapping. And understanding the root causes of some of these impact pathways. And then we really zoom in on the early warning, early action implementation. And here I use early warning, early action. Sometimes I use anticipatory action, I'm sorry for that, where we do a reanalysis of the forecast available at the time for the different drivers and impacts. So in the case of Zambia, for example, that's forecast information around precipitation, the dry spells, but also temperatures, the floods before, food insecurity. In some cases, we have displacement forecasting or sort of outlooks available as well. And And that's how we try and reconstruct a picture of what was available. And then we also have a lot of different interviews with different actors to see how was that information used, and how was that translated into so effective a reaction or not. In the case of our first assessment, which was in Honduras, at the time it was COVID, so we weren't able to do a lot of community engagement. So the methodology really relied on secondary data synthesis, interviews with key experts, and a lot of the field experience from different partners in the field. Luckily, in the case of Zambia and now also Pakistan, we're able to also complement that with a lot of focus group discussions where we get a lot of information from communities. And we complement that again with a geospatial data analysis and the forecast reanalysis as well. So that looks at like time series data. So what we create from these types of research pieces is, of course, reports. We all do reports, and that's a kind of necessary symptom of the work. But what we're really trying to do more with this as well is that this is very applied research, that this is used. So that means that we try and do simulations or sort of what if workshops with actors based on the historical scenario to then say, okay, how do we then use all of this in terms of like counterfactual, basically, generation? Like what could we have done differently and how? And it also directly feeds into the development of early action protocols within, for example, the Red Cross movement, but now also more and more with different actors and partners in the way they approach risk. And I'll speak a little bit about that in case of Honduras. And then we have some really nice sort of science communication tools, which are story maps. And I've put the QR codes at the end of the slides as well. So I'll give a quick update on the Honduras Ida and Iota event, which was our first approach to this research. So Ida and Iota were two tropical cyclones that hit Honduras in the span of 2 weeks in 2020. They had massive impacts. 2.3 million people were affected at the time. It was a huge crisis. Caused widespread flooding across northwestern Honduras as well, displacement, and it coincided at the time with different crises, including a migration crisis, COVID-19, governance issues within the country. And if you look at this disaster timeline, the tropical storms, they just happened at the tail end of a very intense tropical cyclone season, which was influenced by the El Niño La Niña oscillation as well. So the soil was already really saturated, river levels were already really high. At the same time, vulnerabilities were extremely high because of COVID-19. And the year before, they had a multi-year drought, which had resulted in a lot of displacement and migration into the more flood-prone urban areas as well. So in the geospatial analysis, we actually started to overlay some of this to actually see, okay, how did these different drivers in the end interact? And what we see is that this darker area is the area that had the largest overlay of these different events. And of course, it's this overlay, so it doesn't say anything about causation. But this is actually really interesting because the area that's the darkest was also the area where most of the impacts were observed after Ida and Iota. So it does say something about that accumulation of risk and accumulation of impacts over time. We then try to also understand, okay, how do these different things interact and interlink with each other? So this is a graph that kind of shows some of these interactions during the event. And why is this relevant? This is really relevant because it helps us understand what we should be looking at in our anticipatory action systems. That is not just heavy rainfall or cyclones models, etc., but also help us understand how we can predict impacts better and how we understand dynamic vulnerabilities better over time as well. So some of these dynamic pressures are already mentioned, but I think especially the fact around settlement in at-risk areas, I think these are some of the classical things we see in other areas as well, and I think many of you will be familiar with it. But what was very valuable in the case of Honduras was that we were able to identify these different sources of dynamic vulnerability that can now be monitored more closely by different actors in the context. And this is one of the graphs that came out of this. So this is built on the pressure and release framework that has been coined and developed earlier already by Wisner et al. In 2004. It's been around for ages. But we've been adapting it now more and more to be used also in an anticipatory action development context, basically. For the early warning, early action or anticipatory action, it was actually really important to understand which forecasts were issued and what forecasts were actually available and what warnings were issued. And what we actually really identified in this specific study is that there was a discrepancy between what information was available and what information was communicated in terms of which areas were red zones, where were people asked to evacuate, etc. So that mismatch is something that we can really learn from a lot in upcoming events, and that's something that's already happening in Honduras at the moment. Similarly, in Zambia as well, we identified certain forecasts that could have been used more effectively to then trigger action earlier, which is going to be hopefully very useful in the future. And the same for Pakistan, the 2022 floods as well. So as I mentioned already, Zambia and Pakistan are the things that we're working on at the moment. What is really important here is that we're trying to marry these sort of qualitative approaches to forensic disaster risk analysis with the more quantitative approaches to setting up anticipatory action systems with the community perspectives, experiences, and traditional knowledge systems as well. And I think if the moment we try and get that triangle right, I think that's where it's really, really interesting. And I think more and more we're trying to connect also with elements of fragility, conflict, and migration, which is something that really came out very strongly in the Honduras study, and as well in the Pakistan study too. I think in Zambia, it was more related to effective ways that the potential risks for conflict were actually reduced through some of the systems that were already in place around traditional dispute settlement, how aid was actually distributed, how different communities were involved. So that was actually an example of really some good practices and some reasons why there weren't so many conflicts around displacement, etc., as we might see in other contexts. So this is one of those examples of how we try and do systems mapping, and this is a bit too much to absorb at the moment, I think, but I'll share the story maps with you so you can actually explore some of this. And what this actually helps us do a lot is pinpoint some of these impact pathways and create a theory of change for interventions then down the line. So where do we intervene to then break some of these impact pathways? But it's not easy to get this right. And of course, this is just one case, right? So I think we're trying to expand the ability of the organizations that we work with a lot, together with IWMI, who has a lot of capacity on the more long-term thinking around food, land and water management systems, to think, how do we address the root causes of risk in the long term? And how do we manage that residual risk, like the stuff that we can't get right with the longer term interventions, with our shorter term anticipatory action? And that needs a lot of refinement and back and forth, etc. So I think that complexity is something that we're trying to address with these root cause analysis, and then all the follow-up engagement that comes after. And I think that's now something we're very excited about to be able to do now together with IWMI as well, is to develop a toolkit for this. So other organizations and groups can also start to use some of these methodologies and approaches in their work to implement anticipatory action in maybe complex settings where multiple risks converge and different impact pathways affect different people as well. So actually, to just wrap up here, I think these are the two QRs to the different two story maps that I kind of highlighted here, and they show a lot of the different graphics, and you can actually get a sense of what we also learned a lot from the communities here. I think JC and Dr. Pollen will be able to speak a lot more about some of the outcomes of the analysis. I heard gender come up. It was like these kind of differential drivers of vulnerability are really, really important outcomes from the research as well. But I think I'll pause here, stop here, and see if there's any questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That's great. Okay, colleagues, just I took a couple of notes here. I think now finally you know why the session is called forensic analysis, right? I think that that should have come clear from the presentation. Tess, really, thank you very much. That was really fantastic. Think, colleagues, where and how, which would be other geographies that they might benefit from such an analysis. I think what comes what is in the background of all of this is the idea of research for development, right? This is not purely academic research, but you've seen that's also why Dr. Pollen was the first presenter, because this is research that experts like the Climate Center colleagues, together with teams on the ground from, in this case, from IWMI, do jointly with the governments, right? So the idea is that it actually informs and fills in gaps that maybe governments like Zambia or Honduras or others might have in terms of data to inform their policies and strengthen a little bit their capacity for reaction. So it's an interesting partnership. I think it's an interesting model, and I would be very curious to hear from you. What do you think? Where else and who else do we actually need to improve? At the end of the day, what we want to improve is the capacities of the governments and of the communities to address disasters that are going to become more and more and more impactful in the future. So any questions, any remarks? Not you, Sinéad, because you're gonna speak. Sorry. Yes, madam, please.
Again, in Oxfam and in your organizations, you're sort of counting anticipatory action. You sort of basing it on a natural disaster, early warning of a natural disaster, right? And so I wondered does anybody consider anticipatory action around conflict, the sort of human-made disaster? Is that part of the field or is it not? And related to that is the anticipatory action measures that you put in place. Do any of them cover kind of social cohesion or conflict prevention measures?
Yes, please don't go. I want to collect a couple of questions from the floor. Madam, then the gentleman here, and then here. Please go ahead.
Yes, my name is Liliana Jauregui from IUCN, the Netherlands. I'm from the nature conservation world. I'm curious to know more about how the availability of information, how that's at work. Because some governments are not so much willing to share data on climate change because it's delicate and mainly in areas where it's floods and as a result of deforestation, because of drivers of deforestation, these very political, delicate issues, which are not so much about, a disaster like weather disasters like hurricanes and things like that. So I want to know more the side of the political side. How is the information sharing?
Thank you very much.
My name is Emil Haustrup from the Klingendahl Institute. I had a question with regards to how you map out a lot of the anticipatory action that you need to take. If in your research, you also try and account for the effect that climate change will have on these disasters. Do you sort of try and cognize and assess if the climate change will have a negative or a worsening effect on the disasters that you're measuring, if over time, or rather, how do you account for it as a factor, or do you account for it as a factor?
Yes, should we take those three and then make a final round? Is that okay?
So sorry, I had to get my mouse to the unmute button to actually be able to speak. Super interesting questions. I'm so sad I can't see all your faces and see the room. But to get to the first question, anticipatory action for conflict. Yes, this is a very big topic in the sector at the moment. I co-lead a working group within the Anticipation Hub that looks at anticipatory action in conflict settings. And one of the sub-channels of that is actually anticipatory action of the humanitarian impacts of conflict. I think that's a very important nuance. And that's because we're in the humanitarian sector. So there is also a little bit of a question of responsibility, ethical considerations, etc. But I'm super happy to share a couple of resources. So OCHA has a data team that did a study 2 years ago around the forecasting capacity for conflicts. So that's something that has been assessed. The outcomes of that is that it's quite mixed in terms of like actual quantitative models. But of course, we also have a lot of information from sort of underground experts, and some of the anticipatory action partners that we have, they would work more with NGOs. So that's the START network. They have a model where they raise alerts, not based on forecasts alone, but also on what experts think is going to happen. And there it's actually quite common already to do anticipatory action for example, electoral violence or seasonal dynamics that are related to conflict as well. So it's something that's a little bit predictable. There's limits to that as well, right? Like something like high intensity conflict that we see in Ukraine at the moment, and the onset of that is very difficult to anticipate. And there's also a question of whether we should want to be doing that. But what is very important, of course, is to keep track of the impact. So do we see different changes in the migration or displacement flows? Do we see, do we expect impacts on different types of infrastructure, etc.? So there's different forms that anticipatory action can take there. And there is an important distinction there between that and just risk reduction and being prepared as well. So I think this maybe also comes back to, yeah, so I think that's the short answer. So yes, conflict participation is a really big topic at the moment. There are some limitations to what different organizations want and can do on that as well. And then I think the conflict sensitivity of anticipatory action is a really big point as well. So even in our anticipation of natural hazards, we are more and more trying to also improve the conflict sensitivity of interventions in conflict affected areas. So making sure that something that like distribution of non-food items or cash or whatever doesn't aggravate tensions might actually help with social cohesion and could actually do better to have a positive impact as well on FCV related issues. So I hope that helps a little bit, but it's a big topic at the moment and it could be a whole presentation in itself. On the availability of information for these types of studies, yeah, it's a big question. So we do see that in the case of, well, we see differences in terms of like post-disaster information availability, like that's our starting point. What are the impacts and how did things unfold? There's huge differences between countries on that. And then there's, of course, more the gaps around the longer term changes. What has been really helpful for us is the use of geospatial data in combination with community-based conversations, in combination with these types of interviews. So that's been very helpful in that sense. So that triangulation. But of course, these are not these aren't comprehensive studies that really look at these patterns geospatially, quantitatively over the whole, sort of covering a whole country. They're quite focused. And I think that's something that needs to be, that data availability and the data collection to understand these long-term root causes, that's also something that needs to be done more systematically in data collection, etc. So that's one of the recommendations that we've put in the Zambia and Honduras research as well for different partners with different responsibilities to start collecting that information. And then the last point on climate change, yes. So we do look at the signal in terms of climate change dynamics. So in the case of Honduras, in the future, it's more likely that we will see, well, there's actually a decreasing trend in the frequency, that in the signal in terms of like long-term over the next decades of these types of cyclones, but they will become more intense. And one of the issues in Honduras was that the cyclones rapidly intensified. So people actually thought they were going to be quite medium intensity cyclones. And then all of a sudden, in the course of a couple hours, they became so much stronger than people actually thought. So that's going to be something that's going to happen more often as a result of climate change. And therefore, learning from some of these examples is going to be very helpful in terms of adaptation and thinking about the intensity of events we might see in the future. However, of course, anticipatory action is only like a little tiny piece and a little tool in a bigger need for adaptation and disaster risk management to actually deal with some of these risks as a result of climate change. So that's also what I like about these studies, is that they combine longer term interventions with the shorter term interventions as well. And I think that's where we really need to focus on.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm gonna cut the round of questions here because we only have 20 minutes and we still have one more input from Adelphi. But thank you very much. That was great, and I wish you could have seen the colleagues also taking pictures of some of your slides. I think that it was super informative and really, really highly technical. So we appreciate very much you're taking the effort and being here virtually with us. Thank you, colleagues.
Thanks so much for having me. Have a great conference.
Well, I understand that you have to leave, so I think it's okay. Like we can now focus on the presential. Yes, I think one of the interesting things that is also coming also from our colleagues' question, right, is the dynamics between disaster risk management, and that's where we started. We started with disasters, right? But our colleague now is asking, and what about the dimension of climate change, and where does anticipatory action features in between both worlds, and why do we have two different systems for managing one and the other, especially if they are so well interconnected? Why do you have divisions for climate change, and why do you have divisions for disaster risk management? It's some of those open up questions that we need to figure out, especially on issues of governance and institutions, which is one of the issues that Dr. Pollen was making reference, right? How do you manage, and how do you bring some coherence into systems that are inherently incoherent? Good news is that we have Sinéad Barry with us. She also works with, as I said before, with Adelphi, but with a very interesting program on climate diplomacy. So maybe you can say one or two words also about the program itself. And she's going to be sharing with us some of the research that Adelphi has been doing on some of these issues in Yemen. So Sinéad, do you want to come here?
Yeah, wait, I'll have my back to everyone. Yeah, thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm Sinéad, and I'm working with Adelphi's Climate Diplomacy and Security Program. So we do a range of things pertaining to climate security and conflict, climate conflict analysis. I have some brochures around just to showcase some of our work, particularly the Weathering Risk Initiative. Yeah, so I'm happy to get started. So unfortunately, I was not one of the people that could put up my hand and say that I'm an expert on anticipatory action. But what I do hope to add to the discussion is to highlight some of like the gaps where this is really needed, drawing from examples at the intersection of climate change and conflict in Yemen, where we're doing an assessment in collaboration with the European Institute of Peace. My hair is going in, but try to get out of the way. So for those of us that aren't experts on the Yemeni context, I'll just briefly provide some background. So Yemen has been embroiled in a civil war between the internationally recognized government, the Houthi movement, and various other national and international actors since 2014. But political instability and conflict long preceded the outbreak. Even before the civil war broke out, Yemen was among the least well-off countries in West Asia. Now Yemen is divided territorially with two parallel governments, the internationally recognized government and the Houthi institutions, which poses like critical problems in terms of like cross-cutting issues like climate and environmental change. As a result of the war, Yemen has faced one of the worst humanitarian crises globally since World War II. Already at the beginning of 2022, approximately 377,000 people died since the beginning of the war, 60% by indirect causes, including lack of food, water, medicine, and sanitation. Meanwhile, Yemen is significantly at risk of climate change. Between 1971 and 2020, the mean annual temperature in Yemen rose by 0.42 degrees per decade. And now long periods of drought are occurring and are being combined with widespread deforestation, which has become more prevalent during the war, to create a situation of aggravated desertification. This poses a particular problem for Yemen, as around 2/3 of the population are directly employed in agriculture. Meanwhile, disasters, one of the key topics for today, are occurring more frequently and more intensely. People from the Yemeni government that I've spoken to as part of the research say that they remember when they were children, disasters, particularly floods, would of course occur, but now they're happening every year and are much more intense than they were previously. Meanwhile, slightly separate from the climate change issue, but still linked to it, is the environmental issue of water scarcity. This is often mixed up with climate change, but actually water scarcity in Yemen predates climate change, as it does in many regions. Yemen has no major surface water, including lakes or rivers, and is reliant on groundwater aquifers and rainfall for water. The groundwater aquifers are depleting as a result of climate change and resource exploitation, and changing rainfall patterns and decline of traditional mechanisms to harvest rainwater mean that these are no longer being used and cannot be relied upon to irrigate fields. This is, of course, being compounded by very poor climate and environmental governance in Yemen. This has always been an issue in Yemen. Even prior to the civil war, Yemen ranked among the top 10 least ready countries to combat climate change globally. Now, as you can imagine, the situation is much, much worse. The government doesn't have oversight of water extraction, even within the territories that it does control. Generally, whichever most powerful group or wealthy landowners can drill into aquifers ad hoc. Can drill into aquifers ad hoc, and climate change adaptation has very, very little is being done. The war has completely eroded government ability to adapt to climate change, do emergency response to disasters, and do things like strategic urban planning around displacement. So in Yemen, even within the internationally recognized government, people within the environmental institutions, they're telling me that they just simply aren't specific government units available to coordinate across different sectors to do emergency response, or even anticipatory action to prevent disasters or mitigate their effects on the population. So there's two kind of main things that I would like to talk about in this presentation. Firstly, on climate-linked conflict, and secondly, on displacement and disasters. So on the first issue, it's important to note that environmental tensions, as I say, are longstanding. Environmental challenges are longstanding in Yemen and have often led to tensions, and including violent conflict in the past. Water scarcity has always been a long problem and has sporadically escalated into violence. But now these threats are growing as a result of the compound effects of the civil war and climate change, and new challenges are also emerging. Firstly, important disclaimer is that given the scale of scarcity of essential natural resources like water, agricultural land, and forests, the amount of competition that actually does escalate into violent conflict is low, considering how bad the problem is. But at the same time, violent conflict over these resources is ubiquitous in Yemen and has been reported in all of Yemen's 21 governorates. I imagine this room is experts on this topic, but just in case anyone isn't familiar, the typical pathway that this occurs is that in areas that are particularly reliant on agriculture, less water means farmers are unable to irrigate their crops, and unable to earn a living. Then competition emerges over the water resources that are available, for example, wells, basins, etc. And this competition can escalate into violent conflict. So just as an example of this, a colleague of mine from IB, who actually had to flee Yemen last week during the escalation, has told me that her cousin has been arguing with another family over the use of a nearby water well for about a year. They brought the issue to court, but nothing was done. This dispute went on for about a year, and when he was driving home with his friend recently, he was getting out of his car and a member of the other family shot at them, and he was badly injured, and his friend, who hadn't even been part of the initial dispute, was killed. So to say again, resource conflicts have been a long problem and are somewhat independent of the civil war, in that they're not necessarily linked to any political ends, but now they're being framed and exacerbated by the war in several ways. So even prior to the war, Yemen had one of the most armed populations globally, and as you can imagine, this has become even more the case since. Now the population is more armed than ever, further risking escalation. But perhaps one of the most key ways in which this is occurring is that the war has basically decimated irrigation infrastructure. In regions like the Kamfara district of Abyan, about 85% of irrigation infrastructure has been destroyed by the war. Again, has been destroyed by the war, and the sub-canals are blocked by conflict debris, sedimentation, and waste. And the government has no ability to clear this. As a result, there's less water, and farmers are compensating in a variety of ways, including building alternative irrigation infrastructure, which very cleverly diverts water away from the block canals, but also diverts water away from downstream users. So residents in the area are afraid that the next time a neighboring family does this, violent conflict will emerge in their village as a result. So unfortunately, I've spoken too much and only have a couple of minutes left. But yeah, so I'll just briefly mention issue of displacement and disasters. So as a result of livelihood loss by drought and slow onset events, in addition to civil war, rural-urban migration has been enormous in Yemen. Because of the civil war and to a lesser extent disasters, 13% of the entire population is displaced. And cities have been unable to cope with the surge of new arrivals. I think, a good illustration of it was in Tessa's slide. But what is happening is some key developments at the intersection of climate change and conflict. So in Aden, where the internationally recognized government sits now, settlements were constructed for IDPs in low-lying areas, which previously acted as natural flood draining systems. As a result, flood impacts have become worse, and there have been situations where families have been displaced by the civil war initially and now have been displaced 2 or even 3 more times due to floods. Very quickly, after this very bleak presentation, just some notes on what to do. So overall, there's an enormous research gap on Yemen in general, but specifically on climate-related security risks in Yemen. So to anticipate complex crises and design productive strategies, much more information is needed. And this information, of course, cannot just come from speaking to elite Yemenis or doing quantitative analysis, but really needs interviews with Yemenis across territories from all segments of societies. And early warning systems, of course, need to be constructed in Yemen, but they also need to be built in a way that's compatible with the conflict-affected regions. Early warning systems are well and good to anticipate conflict, but they need to really be linked to actions that can help to mitigate these effects. Sorry. I'm nervous looking at the moderator.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
I know the situation has been super. That's what I hate from talking about these topics, because you get very excited researchers come and tell me on Skype, it's gonna be great, and at the same time, the subject matter is really, really, really tragical, right? So actually, what you're saying is, but your passion, I find it fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You want to continue?
So just as a last final point that I'm sure many of us have been seeing Yemen reappear in the news in the last 6 months, and even in the last 2 weeks with the recent escalation for the first time in a very long time. But what's really missing, I'm not sure if any of you have really seen on the news with the escalations of the Red Sea and securing shipping lines, any of these issues about the really deep environmental crisis that's unraveling beneath Yemen's war. And I'd just like to highlight that it's very important not to view these issues dichotomously, that because climate change is driving conflict that's not linked to the civil war or regional conflict. Now it doesn't mean that it doesn't need to be addressed. Natural resource conflicts are killing about 4,000 people in Yemen every year, but aren't appearing on the agendas of international international conflict analyses or foreign policy.
Fantastic. Colleagues, 1 or 2 questions for Sinéad on the issue of Yemen, or any other issue that you want to come in. Now we have only 5 or 7 minutes. No, even if you want to come with something different or something to Yemen, it's also okay. Please go ahead.
One address to Sinead. I'm Jen from the University of Vienna, and I was wondering if, I mean, you addressed the research gap being very vast. So I was wondering if there's any literature linking